They called me a disgrace during their charity gala, selling a perfect family image with sugar-coated cakes. My mother raised her glass, publicly disowning me for being a single mother. I did not cry. I simply walked on stage and dropped an envelope thinner than fondant. The ballroom froze upon realizing who owned their company debt. They thought they cut me off. In reality, the countdown to their ruin had begun, and for the first time, they would beg me to return. My name is Addison Watson. It was exactly 10:45 in the evening when the notification illuminated the darkened office of Grayline Ledger Group, while the rest of the city slept. I sat bathed in the sterile blue light of my monitors, reviewing a corporate restructuring model. But the alert on my personal phone was not about distressed assets or supply chain logistics. It was a live stream link, forwarded by a former associate. The location tag read the Oglethorpe Grand Hotel, Savannah, Georgia. It was the night of the annual Sugar Crown benefit. For decades, my family had used this charity gala to mask their ruthless corporate practices behind a veneer of Southern hospitality and philanthropy. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration of children and nutrition, funded entirely by the profits of Watson Sugar and Confections. I tapped the screen. The video buffered for a fraction of a second before resolving into a high-definition broadcast of the hotel's grand ballroom. The aesthetic was sickeningly sweet. Gold ribbons draped over antique crystal chandeliers, and the tables were adorned with towering displays of spun sugar and fondant-covered cakes. Standing at the center podium, bathed in a warm, flattering spotlight, was my mother, Celeste Watson. She looked impeccable, as always. Her emerald evening gown caught the light as she raised a champagne flute, but her smile was sharp, calculated, and entirely devoid of warmth. "We gather tonight to celebrate family." Celeste's voice echoed through the venue's expensive sound system, laced with a practiced, sorrowful tremor. But true family requires sacrifice, morality, and adherence to values. Sadly, not everyone can uphold that standard. Many of you have asked about my eldest daughter over the last 6 years. Tonight, I must be honest, she chose a path of profound selfishness. She chose to be a single mother, bringing shame to our name, abandoning her responsibilities to her heritage. She is a cautionary tale of what happens when one turns away from the light of a proper, respectable family. I watched her wipe an invisible tear from her cheek. The camera panned over the audience. Hundreds of Savannah's elite, business moguls, charity board members, and local politicians nodded in solemn, judgment-laced sympathy. Below the video player, the social media feed was an active war zone. My mother had tagged over 300 high-profile accounts in the broadcast. The comments cascaded down the screen in real time. My younger sister, Piper, had pinned her own remark to the top of the feed. "It breaks my heart, but family values must always come first." A second later, her husband, Nolan Hale, the polished chief financial officer of our family empire, chimed in beneath her, "Accountability is difficult for those who lack a basic moral compass." They were crucifying me live on the internet, selling their perfect image by using my life as their sacrificial lamb. I did not throw the phone across the room. My pulse did not elevate. Crying was a luxury I had abandoned 6 years ago when they erased me from my own life. I simply minimized the video feed, opened a secure, encrypted folder on my desktop, and clicked a single button. The heavy-duty laser printer in the corner of my office hummed to life. It spat out precisely 4 sheets of high-bond legal paper. I gathered them, stapled the top left corner with mechanical precision, and slid the document into a crisp, unmarked manila envelope. Next, I picked up my desk phone and dialed the number for Mara Quinn, my lead in-house corporate counsel. She answered on the second ring. "Mara," I said, my voice completely flat. "I am watching the feed." "Addison," Mara replied, her tone equally businesslike and devoid of pity. "Are we proceeding?" "Yes, Be ready to confirm the filing time in exactly 35 minutes, I hung up. Before standing, I checked the private security application on my phone. The encrypted feed from my home cameras showed my house was utterly peaceful. In the upstairs bedroom, my 8-year-old daughter, Nora, was sound asleep under a thick woven blanket. Down the hall, our trusted nanny was quietly reading a book. Nora was safe, completely shielded from the venomous theater playing out across the city. She would never have to face the people who considered her existence a stain on their pristine reputation. I grabbed my car keys and walked out into the humid, heavy night air. It took exactly 22 minutes to drive to the Oglethorpe Grand. I did not bother with the valet stand. I parked my dark sedan in the executive lot, walking past the long line of imported sports cars and stretched limousines. I was dressed in a tailored charcoal wool suit, an immaculate white silk blouse, and black leather stilettos. I wore no jewelry, save for a vintage steel dive watch. There was no glittering necklace, no designer logo to broadcast my net worth. I was the absolute antithesis of the sugar-coated decadence inside. When I pushed through the heavy brass-trimmed doors of the ballroom, the immediate shift in the atmosphere was palpable. I stood at the back of the room for a fleeting moment, a dark silhouette against the golden glow. Several older donors, men and women who had known me since I was a young woman running supply chain logistics for the factory, turned their heads. Their eyes widened in shock. They had been told I was a destitute failure, living in squalor and regret. Yet, the woman standing before them radiated a cold, undeniable authority. I did not look like a tragedy. I looked like a blade. On stage, Celeste was just wrapping up her emotional monologue. And so, we must look out for the children who truly need our guidance, unlike those who squander their privileges for fleeting rebellions. I began walking down the center aisle. My heels struck the marble flooring with a sharp, rhythmic cadence that cut violently through the soft murmurs of the crowd. The guests parted like water. The whispering started at the back of the room and rolled forward like a tidal wave. Piper, sitting at the head table near the stage, dropped her champagne flute. The crystal shattered against the floor. But nobody looked at her. All eyes were locked on me. Celeste faltered. Her manicured hands gripped the edges of the wooden podium. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her pale beneath her heavy stage makeup. Nolan Hale stood up from his chair, his jaw clenched, adjusting his expensive tuxedo jacket as if preparing for a physical altercation. I did not look at Nolan. I did not look at Piper. I kept my eyes focused entirely on my mother as I climbed the 4 velvet-lined steps to the stage. Celeste's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She expected a screaming match. She expected a hysterical, broken woman begging for forgiveness or screaming obscenities to ruin her perfect gala. I stepped directly up to the microphone. The air in the room was so tense it felt brittle enough to snap. I reached out and gently placed the thin manila envelope directly over my mother's handwritten prompt cards. I leaned into the microphone. My voice was quiet, completely devoid of any anger or sorrow. Yet it echoed with terrifying clarity across the silent, breathless ballroom. I am here to deliver a legal notice to the borrower. A collective gasp rippled through the hundreds of guests. Celeste's trembling hand reached for the flap of the envelope. She pulled out the 4 sheets of paper. I watched her eyes dart across the bold, capitalized heading printed at the top of the very first page. It was a senior note assignment. For months, Watson Sugar and Confections had been quietly hemorrhaging cash, surviving on a massive revolving credit facility from a major commercial bank. What they did not know, what Nolan had failed to realize in his arrogance, was that the bank had grown tired of their delayed audits and broken covenants. The bank had quietly auctioned off the distressed debt. Celeste read the name of the new primary creditor, the legal entity that now held the financial life or death of her entire empire in its hands. Gray Line Ledger Group. The heavy paper slipped from her trembling fingers, fluttering down to rest against a decorative tower of golden cupcakes. She looked up at me, pure terror finally cracking her perfect porcelain mask. The entire room stood frozen, trapped in the chilling realization that the daughter they had just publicly buried was now the one holding the deed to the graveyard. 6 years ago, the world as I knew it ceased to exist. I was 28 years old, carrying a child in my womb, and staring at the closed door after the man I thought I loved walked out forever. He panicked at the prospect of fatherhood. I did not. I chose to keep the baby. I chose Nora. That single, solitary decision was the spark that burned my previous life to the ground. My family did not scream. They did not raise their hands or hurl expensive porcelain against the wall. The violence of the truly wealthy is rarely physical. It is almost entirely administrative. To my mother, Celeste, my pregnancy was not a daughter in a moment of vulnerability. It was a social stain. It was an unseemly, glaring blemish threatening to ruin the pristine aesthetics of her perfect family portrait right before the crucial winter gala season. I was a public relations crisis wrapped in maternity clothes. The erasure was swift, silent, and absolute. I was quietly cropped out of the lavish holiday marketing materials. My name was permanently scrubbed from the charity committee rosters. The embossed invitations to Sunday dinners simply stopped arriving. They were amputating an infected limb to save the host body, isolating me completely to preserve their carefully curated image of traditional perfection. My father, Grant Watson, could have stopped it. He was the patriarch, the name on the building, but he was fundamentally hollow inside. He had perfected the cowardly art of looking at the floor. He always chose to keep the peace, and in the Watson household, peace was strictly defined as whatever Celeste dictated. On the afternoon, I packed my belongings into a single suitcase. He stood by the heavy mahogany door of his study, swirling amber scotch in a crystal glass. He did not meet my eyes. He did not offer a hand of support. He let the front door click shut behind me, sealing my fate with his pathetic, suffocating silence. They did not just cut me out of the family tree. They systematically dismantled my professional life. I was pushed out of Watson's Sugar and Confections. I was not a useless figurehead. I was the head of operations. I knew the exact viscosity required for every batch of liquid cane. I knew the precise tonnage of raw imports sitting in the ports of Savannah. I knew the vendor contracts, the delivery schedules, and the warehouse capacities down to the minute. I breathed the scent of burnt sugar and industrial machinery. It was my life and my passion. But they quietly revoked my access badges, deactivated my corporate accounts, and legally froze the family trust funds I had relied upon. I was cast out into the blistering heat of reality with $0, zero safety net, and a child on the way. I did not break. I did not return to their wrought iron gates on my knees. I rented a cramped, second-floor apartment where the radiator rattled through the night. I took exhausting contract jobs in the grimmest, most demanding corners of corporate finance. While my former peers were attending yacht parties and charity luncheons, I was buried in risk analysis, forensic accounting, and distressed debt restructuring. I spent countless nights rocking Nora to sleep with one arm while tracing hidden liabilities and offshore shell companies with the other. I sat in small, windowless rooms, dissecting the financial corpses of bankrupt companies. It was in those dark, quiet rooms that I discovered my true weapon. I realized I had an extraordinary, almost surgical talent for reading the architecture of financial deception. Numbers do not lie, but the terrified people who write them do. I learned to look beneath the glossy veneer of a pristine balance sheet and see the systemic rot hiding in the footnotes. I could spot the phantom revenue, the buried operational liabilities, and the desperate, hollow core of failing enterprises that thought they were clever enough to outrun the math. That was the foundation upon which Grayline Ledger Group was built. I started the firm from absolutely nothing, armed only with a cheap laptop on a folding dining table. Grayline specialized in survival and exposure. We provided intense risk management, aggressive forensic accounting, and strategic acquisitions of distressed corporate debt. I built a formidable, ironclad reputation by stepping into the wreckage of dying mid-sized companies and pulling them back from the brink of liquidation. I hunted down embezzled funds, restructured toxic loans, and carved out the parasitic executives who were draining the life from the honest workers. I operated entirely in the shadows. There were no media interviews. There were no press releases or glamorous networking mixers. I deliberately avoided the spotlight, and I strictly forbade anyone in my orbit from ever mentioning the name Watson, while I built a titanium fortress in the dark. My family continued to build a glass castle in the blistering sun. They paraded their artisanal sugar empire across every social media platform. They sold a highly curated lifestyle of deep-rooted Southern aristocracy. Piper posted flawless, sun-drenched videos of vintage sugar molds and beautifully staged factory floors. They projected an impenetrable image of invincible generational wealth. But I knew the truth. I knew the crushing, relentless weight of their overhead. I knew the unforgiving reality of an outdated supply chain. They were not thriving. They were surviving on a razor-thin wire of extended credit lines, desperate corporate sponsorships, and the sheer, blinding momentum of their own fabricated image. It was a spectacular illusion, completely reliant on the ignorance of their lenders and the blind, unquestioning faith of their wealthy donors. They believed they had stripped me of all my power and institutional knowledge when they marched me out of the corporate headquarters 6 years ago, but they had profoundly underestimated my meticulous nature. Long before my security clearance was revoked and my servers were wiped, I had secured a private, encrypted backup of the master operations ledger. It was just an old snapshot of the supply chain, the internal inventory flows, and the baseline vendor contracts from my final days at the helm. To anyone else, it was merely outdated, irrelevant data. To me, it was the master key. It was the absolute, unalterable architectural blueprint of their historical reality. Over the years, I kept it securely locked away. I watched their inflated public numbers, their miraculous quarterly reports, and I quietly compared them to the structural, operational truth I had preserved. That old data drive was a dormant seed, planted deep in the cold earth, waiting patiently for the exact right season to bloom. It was the anchor of reality that would eventually prove every lie they had told since the day they threw me away. They thought I had disappeared into the background, reduced to a cautionary tale. But I had not disappeared. I had simply become the quiet architect of their impending ruin. The silence in the ballroom was absolute, a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed against the gold-leafed walls. My mother stood frozen behind the podium, her manicured fingers still resting on the legal document I had just delivered. The color had completely vanished from her face. She recovered with the jagged, frantic energy of a cornered animal. She leaned aggressively into the microphone, her voice shrill, entirely stripping away the genteel Southern belle persona she had peddled for decades. "Security," Celeste commanded, her voice vibrating with a sudden, ugly panic. She pointed a trembling finger at my chest. "Get the event manager. Remove this woman immediately. She is trespassing on a private, ticketed event." 2 men in dark suits stepped forward from the shadows of the banquet doors, accompanied by the hotel's panicked event director. They approached the stage, their faces tense, ready to physically escort me out. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I simply reached into the inner pocket of my tailored jacket and withdrew a secondary, smaller sheet of heavy stock paper. I held it out to the event director as he reached the bottom of the stage steps. "I strongly advise you to read that before you instruct your staff to touch me," I said, my voice barely above a conversational murmur. Yet it carried clearly in the dead quiet of the room. The director scanned the document. It was a standard corporate access injunction, legally binding and notarized, granting the primary debt holder unhindered access to the corporate officers of the defaulting entity. The director's face flushed. He swallowed hard, looking up at my mother, then took a cautious step back. waving the security guards away. "Mrs. Watson," the director whispered, his voice trembling. "She has a legal right to be here. I cannot forcibly remove a registered creditor." Celeste looked as though she had been struck. She gripped the edges of the podium so tightly her knuckles turned a stark white. I turned my back to her and faced the sea of guests. Hundreds of the wealthiest individuals in the state were staring at me, their champagne flutes hovering forgotten in midair. I kept my posture relaxed, my expression completely neutral. "Please, continue your evening." I addressed the crowd, projecting my voice clearly without shouting. "I have no intention of seizing assets or foreclosing on the property tonight. I am simply fulfilling a statutory obligation. I am here solely to deliver a formal notice of default, as explicitly required by the terms of your host's lending agreement following multiple severe violations of their financial covenants." Before the murmurs could begin, a sharp, patronizing laugh cut through the tension. It was Nolan Hale. He stepped out from behind the head table, aggressively adjusting the cuffs of his tailored tuxedo. He wore a mask of arrogant amusement, but the tight lines around his mouth betrayed his underlying panic. He walked toward the stage, attempting to reclaim the narrative with his polished, corporate charm. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this bizarre theatrical display," Nolan announced, projecting his voice to the back of the room. He shot me a glare filled with pure venom. "Do not let this alarm you. What you are witnessing is nothing more than a desperate psychological stunt. It is the sad, bitter cry for attention from a single mother who simply cannot accept that she is no longer relevant to this family or this company." He smiled smoothly at the audience, expecting them to nod in agreement, to dismiss me as a hysterical outcast. I did not raise my voice. I simply dismantled his lie with cold, hard chronology. "Your primary revolving credit facility was auctioned off exactly 14 days ago," I stated clearly, locking eyes with Nolan. "The original lending institution liquidated your debt after Watson Sugar failed to submit its mandatory quarterly audit report for the third consecutive time. You are operating on fumes, Nolan, and the fumes ran out 2 weeks ago." A sudden, distinct shift occurred in the ballroom. These were not naive socialites. The room was filled with venture capitalists, real estate developers, and corporate board members. They understood the lethal gravity of a missed audit. All around the room, hands dipped into tuxedo pockets and designer evening bags. The soft, collective glow of smartphone screens began to illuminate the dim faces of the guests. Within seconds, the murmurs escalated into sharp, urgent whispers. Uniform commercial code filings are matters of public record. A wealthy shipping magnate sitting at a table near the front leaned over to his wife, his voice carrying in the tense air. "The collateral registry changed," the man whispered urgently. "The lien holder on the manufacturing facility was updated last Tuesday. She is telling the truth." The golden illusion shattered completely. The grand philanthropic facade my family had meticulously built evaporated, leaving only the stark reality of their insolvency. Sensing the catastrophic loss of control, Piper resorted to her most reliable weapon. She stood up from the head table, her face crumpling into an expression of profound, theatrical agony. Tears immediately spilled over her perfectly contoured cheeks. "Why are you doing this?" Piper sobbed, her voice echoing dramatically. "We are trying to raise money for starving children. You just want to ruin our charity night because you are jealous. You are trying to destroy the only good thing we do." I turned my gaze to my younger sister. The sheer hypocrisy of her tears was exhausting, but I refused to engage with her manufactured emotional crisis. Instead, I focused on the one thread that could unravel their entire operation. "Since we are discussing the integrity of the charity," I said, my tone dropping to a chilling, clinical register. I looked past Piper, locking my eyes directly onto Nolan's suddenly pale face. "Has this foundation submitted its most recent quarterly disbursement report to the State Oversight Board?" The effect was instantaneous and devastating. The arrogant smirk vanished from Nolan's face, replaced by a raw, unmasked terror. His jaw slackened, and he visibly stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. It was a micro-expression of pure guilt, and in a room full of sharp-eyed investors, it was as loud as a gunshot. That report was their hidden vulnerability, the bleeding artery they had desperately tried to conceal. I did not need him to answer. His silence was a complete confession. I had accomplished my objective. The legal notice was served, the narrative was fractured, and the seed of doubt was firmly planted in the minds of their most crucial financial lifelines. Lingering would only invite a messy, emotional screaming match, and I operated strictly on calculated leverage, not sentiment. I stepped away from the microphone and walked calmly down the stairs of the stage. The crowd parted for me once again, but this time, the stairs were not filled with shock. They were filled with a wary, calculating respect. I paused at the center of the ballroom aisle and turned back toward the stage one last time. On Monday morning at 8 o'clock sharp, I announced, my voice slicing through the heavy silence. My firm will formally issue a demand for a comprehensive, independent inspection of your corporate ledgers. Furthermore, we will mandate an immediate, binding freeze on all non-essential company expenditures. Enjoy the rest of your evening. I turned and walked toward the heavy brass doors. Behind me, Celeste lost the last remaining shred of her sanity. She grabbed the microphone, her voice shrieking through the speakers, devoid of any polish or grace. "You are dead to us!" she screamed, her voice cracking with pure hatred. "You have severed your own bloodline. You are nothing to this family." I pushed through the doors and stepped out into the cool, quiet hallway. I did not look back. My mother had just publicly and hysterically threatened her primary creditor in front of 300 high society witnesses. She thought she was banishing me, but she had only succeeded in driving the final nail into her own coffin. The charity gala continued behind the closed doors, but the Watson empire was already dead. They just did not know how to grieve yet. The email arrived less than 48 hours after the gala. The subject line read simply, "Internal resolution." It was from Nolan. He requested a private, off-the-record sit-down at their temporary corporate annex downtown. He framed it as an opportunity to find an amicable solution and save the remaining dignity of the family name. I did not go alone. At exactly 10 o'clock on Tuesday morning, I pushed open the frosted glass doors of their leased suite. I was flanked by Mara Quinn and a certified corporate stenographer named Elias. Nolan was waiting in the main conference room, pacing over the cheap carpet. Piper was sitting at the far end of the long laminate table, aggressively twisting a diamond ring around her finger. When Nolan saw my entourage, his forced, diplomatic smile vanished instantly. "What is this, Addison?" Nolan demanded, his voice tight. I clearly stated this was a private family discussion. I pulled out a chair and sat down, gesturing for Mara and Elias to take the seats beside me. Elias immediately opened his laptop and rested his hands over the keys. "This is a formal meeting between a primary creditor and an entity in default," I replied smoothly. "There is no family in this room. There is only a balance sheet. Elias will be transcribing the minutes of this meeting to ensure complete transparency. Do we have your consent to proceed on the record, or should we adjourn and meet in a federal courtroom?" Nolan glared at Elias, then looked at me. His jaw muscles flexed, but he nodded stiffly. Elias's fingers began to fly across the keyboard, the quiet, rhythmic clicking filling the tense air. Seeing that his charm offensive was dead on arrival, Nolan swiftly changed tactics. He leaned over the table, planting his palms flat against the faux wood grain, attempting to project physical dominance. "You do not understand the public relations nightmare you created on Saturday," Nolan hissed, his voice dropping into a menacing register. "You caused a panic among our Tier 1 sponsors. Our legal team is currently drafting a tortious interference and defamation suit against you. You are destroying the brand equity, and we will hold you personally liable for the damages." I remained completely still. I let his threat hang in the air for 5 full seconds, absorbing the panic radiating from his posture. When I finally spoke, I did not address the lawsuit. I simply asked a question. Why was the payment to the Louisiana Sugarcane Cooperative returned for insufficient funds last month? Nolan blinked, entirely derailed by the pivot. That was an administrative banking error. And the secondary marketing ledger? I asked, my voice flat, relentless. Why were the operational expense accounts drained 3 weeks prior to the scheduled quarterly audit? We are reallocating resources, Nolan snapped, a bead of sweat forming at his temple. It is a standard cash flow maneuver. You are stalling, I stated, staring directly into his eyes. You lack the liquidity to cover your basic operational liabilities. Where did the harvest deposit money go? Nolan. The psychological pressure in the room was immense. Nolan was accustomed to dealing with my father, a man who withered under confrontation, or my mother, who only cared about the optics. He was completely unprepared for an interrogation rooted entirely in forensic accounting. We had to secure the winter holiday campaign, Nolan blurted out, his voice cracking with sudden, defensive anger. He threw his hands up in frustration. We temporarily utilized the raw material deposit funds to lock in the media buys. It was a strategic necessity to maintain consumer visibility. We are going to reimburse the operational accounts the moment the big deal closes. It is a minor bridge loan to ourselves. Mara Quinn's pen stopped moving. Beside me, I felt a distinct shift in her posture. Nolan had just confessed to a massive, undeniable breach of fiduciary duty. Misappropriating secured operational funds to cover unsecured marketing expenses was not a strategy. It was financial fraud, and it was now permanently immortalized in the stenographer's official transcript. Piper, unable to endure the heavy silence that followed her husband's confession, slammed her hands on the table. She stood up, her face flushed with a toxic mixture of panic and deep-seated sibling resentment. "You are just jealous," Piper yelled, her voice echoing shrilly against the glass walls. "You have always been jealous of me. I am the face of this brand. I am the one the public loves. You are just trying to drag us down because you have nothing, but you are not going to win. Once the buyer in Dallas finalizes the acquisition, we will pay off your stupid debt, and we will never have to look at you again." The room went dead silent. Even the clicking of Elias's keyboard paused for a fraction of a second. Nolan turned slowly toward his wife, his face draining of blood until he looked physically ill. Piper looked around the room, realizing too late that she had just shattered a massive, carefully guarded secret. Mara Quinn leaned toward me, her voice a barely audible whisper. A buyer in Dallas. Unilateral negotiation of assets without disclosing the intent to the primary lien holder. It was a catastrophic legal error. They were attempting to quietly sell the company, or at least its core assets, behind my back to escape the debt. This was a direct violation of the standard covenants tied to their loan. Piper had just handed me the very weapon I needed to freeze their operations entirely. Realizing the magnitude of the disaster, Nolan frantically reached into his leather briefcase. His hands were visibly trembling. He pulled out a thick manila folder and shoved it across the table toward me. "Look," Nolan stammered, abandoning all pretense of authority. "We can make this highly lucrative for you. Addison, I have a term sheet right here. We are prepared to offer you a premium extension on the loan maturity. We will increase the interest rate by 4%. All you have to do is sign this waiver." I did not open the folder. I slowly dragged it closer with my index finger, glancing at the front page. "A waiver of what?" I asked softly. "A standard grace period," Nolan said, swallowing hard. "You grant us 90 days of operational autonomy. No forensic audits, no ledger inspections. You step back for 3 months, and we guarantee your payout with a premium." It was a desperate, blindingly obvious trap. A 90-day blind spot would give him exactly enough time to finalize the illicit Dallas deal, liquidate the remaining valuable assets, and leave Grayline Ledger Group holding a hollow, bankrupt shell. It was the frantic flailing of a man who knew he was already drowning. I looked at the contract, then up at Nolan, and finally at Piper, who was sinking back into her chair, her eyes wide with fear. I did not argue. I did not gloat. I simply pushed the folder back across the table. "No," I said quietly. I stood up, buttoning my jacket. Mara and Elias immediately followed suit. "Addison, be reasonable," Nolan pleaded, his voice rising in panic as I turned toward the door. "You are going to tank the whole enterprise. You will put hundreds of people out of work." I paused at the threshold, turning back to face him one last time. "I am not tanking the enterprise. Nolan," I replied, my voice perfectly calm and devoid of sympathy. "You did that the moment you decided to steal from your own factory to pay for a billboard. We will see you in court." I walked out into the bright morning light, feeling the warm air against my skin. I had not signed their desperate agreement, but I walked away with exactly what I came for. I had their admissions, I knew their timeline, and I had just discovered the invisible Dallas buyer. The board was fully set, and they had no idea I was about to sweep all their pieces onto the floor. 72 hours after the disastrous meeting, my forensic accounting team descended upon the manufacturing plant and corporate headquarters. I did not send men in suits to shout or make threats. I sent 6 of Gray Line's sharpest auditors, armed with data extraction software and ironclad legal mandates. They moved through the executive offices like a silent, methodical storm, duplicating hard drives, pulling warehouse manifests, and seizing every physical ledger they could find. I set up a makeshift war room in a vacant office down the hall from Nolan's suite. The real story of the family empire was not told in their glossy brochures or highly curated social media feeds. It was written in black ink, buried under layers of desperate accounting tricks and white sugar. It took my lead analyst less than 48 hours to find the first structural fracture. The company was not merely suffering from a temporary lack of liquidity, they were actively hiding a massive operational failure. We cross-referenced the raw material intake with the outbound shipping logs and uncovered a staggering discrepancy. Thousands of pallets of premium product had been manufactured with defective binding agents, rendering them completely unsellable. Instead of writing off the loss and taking the hit on their balance sheet, Nolan had quietly moved the spoiled inventory to an off-site, climate-controlled storage facility. He was keeping it classified on the books as active, high-value assets. Furthermore, they had incurred massive, unrecorded internal recall costs, quietly paying off disgruntled distributors to keep the spoiled batches out of the press. They were paying premium warehouse rates to store literal rotting garbage just to artificially inflate their asset column and trick their lenders. The deeper we dug into the ledgers, the darker the numbers became. The most damning discovery emerged when we traced the wire transfers routed through the public relations department. I noticed a recurring, highly opaque line item labeled as Regional Community Engagement Initiatives. It took a skilled forensic tracer to follow the money through 3 different internal shell accounts. The source of those funds was not corporate revenue, it was the Charity Benefit Fund. My mother had personally authorized the transfer of hundreds of thousands of dollars from the foundation account to cover the exorbitant costs of a high-end brand activation campaign in Los Angeles. She had effectively drained her own philanthropic foundation to pay for imported champagne and celebrity endorsements, laundering the embezzlement through circular internal billing. It was a breathtaking level of arrogance. I thought I had become entirely numb to their deception. But finding my father's signature on a secondary mezzanine loan file elicited a sharp pang of pity. Grant had pledged his own personal assets, including the ancestral family estate, as collateral for a high-interest cash injection. Attached to the file was a memo from Nolan, assuring my father the money was strictly for expanding the primary packaging line to meet new demands. I pulled the disbursement records immediately. Not a single cent went to the factory floor. The entire loan was instantly swallowed by outstanding public relations debts and extravagant travel expenses for executive partner meetings. My father had unknowingly mortgaged his home to pay for Nolan's private jet rentals and luxury hotel suites. I did not move to crush them right away. I am a practitioner of patience. I needed the evidentiary chain to be absolutely airtight, ensuring that when they inevitably launched their next public smear campaign, the unvarnished truth would automatically trigger their collapse without me having to say a word. My patience was rewarded late Thursday evening. My encrypted inbox pinged with a secure message from a private address. Attached were 40 pages of internal server logs and deleted email threads. The sender was an old factory floor manager, a man whose pension I had quietly saved during a minor corporate restructuring dispute 8 years ago. Loyalty on the factory floor runs much deeper than loyalty in the boardroom. The leaked emails were a goldmine. They contained explicit, written directives from Nolan to the internal accounting team, ordering them to repeatedly alter the final submission dates for the quarterly audits. He was artificially delaying the process because he knew a legitimate audit would expose the fraud and trigger an immediate default. It proved undeniable premeditation, armed with the internal communications. I finally turned my attention to the savior my sister had foolishly mentioned in our meeting, the buyer in Dallas. I ran a comprehensive trace on all external communications containing non-disclosure agreements over the past 6 months. It took exactly 3 hours to find the file. It was a complete joke. It was not a binding acquisition agreement. It was not even a formal term sheet. It was a flimsy 2-page letter of interest from a mid-tier beverage conglomerate. The document explicitly stated that any potential discussion was entirely contingent upon a clean bill of financial health and unencumbered assets. There was no rescue deal. Nolan was leveraging a meaningless piece of paper to placate his panicked wife and stall his creditors, hoping for a miracle that mathematically could never arrive. Mara stepped into the war room just as the sun began to set. Reviewing the neatly organized stacks of evidence I had compiled on the conference table, she dropped a red legal folder onto the center of the wood grain. "We have more than enough," Mara stated, her voice clinical and precise, devoid of any emotion. "This is gross negligence, fraud, and direct misappropriation of secured funds. We need to prepare 2 parallel tracks immediately. Option 1 is a hostile corporate restructuring. We force the company into receivership, take the wheel, and try to save the underlying assets and the workforce. Option 2 is an immediate, aggressive foreclosure. We call the debt, seize the collateral, liquidate the assets to cover our position, and let the state authorities deal with the embezzlement." I walked over to the window, watching the factory smokestacks blowing white steam into the twilight sky. The steady, rhythmic thrum of the heavy machinery vibrated through the glass. I thought about the hundreds of workers down there who relied on those weekly wages to feed their families, pay their mortgages, and live their lives. They were the people who actually built the wealth my family so carelessly squandered on image and ego. They did not deserve to lose their livelihoods because of the incompetence sitting in the executive suites. I turned back to Mara, resting my hands on the damning ledgers that outlined the impending doom of a century-old legacy. I chose the path that required significantly more effort but preserved the only thing worth saving. I would meticulously salvage the enterprise from the inside out, protecting the workers and the physical infrastructure. But I would absolutely not salvage the fragile egos or the luxurious lifestyles of the people who broke it. The surgery would be brutal, and they would not survive the operation. The digital bombardment began exactly 48 hours after I deployed my forensic team. My phone vibrated endlessly against the solid wood of my desk, lighting up with a relentless stream of notifications, tags, and forwarded messages, having failed to intimidate me in the boardroom. My family resorted to the only battlefield they truly understood. They launched a coordinated, vicious social media warfare campaign designed to burn my reputation to ash before I could expose their financial rot. My mother fired the first shot. Celeste posted a lengthy, emotionally manipulative manifesto on the Savannah Philanthropic League Community Board, a private forum accessed by every wealthy socialite and charity organizer in the state. She painted a tragic portrait of a betrayed matriarch. She explicitly named me a ruthless debt vulture, claiming I had manipulated legal loopholes out of pure. deep-seated personal revenge to destroy the family enterprise. She wrote that I was willing to put hundreds of loyal factory workers on the street simply to satisfy a bitter childhood grudge. Within an hour, my younger sister amplified the assault. Piper took to her highly curated social media accounts, uploading a heavily filtered, strategically cropped photograph from 8 years ago. The image showed me walking away from the family estate with a single suitcase, looking exhausted and disheveled. The caption was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive venom. She wrote about the pain of a sister who ran away from her responsibilities, abandoning her heritage, only to return a decade later with her hand out, greedy for the money she never helped earn. Piper expertly shifted the narrative away from corporate insolvency and turned it into a scandalous, moral failing on my part. The final, most dangerous maneuver came from Nolan. An anonymous contact within the charity network forwarded me an email blast Nolan had blind copied to their top 50 financial sponsors. It was a masterpiece of corporate panic dressed as righteous concern. Nolan claimed that my aggressive legal tactics were directly threatening to shut down the Children's Nutrition Fund. He explicitly stated that my demands for asset freezes would halt all community meal distributions by the end of the month, effectively holding starving children hostage to leverage a better payout for my predatory lending firm. The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking. They were weaponizing the very charity they had been systematically robbing to shield themselves from accountability. Mara Quinn walked into my office, dropping a thick stack of printed social media comments and the forwarded emails onto my desk. Her expression was tight with professional outrage. She urged me to file an immediate cease and desist order and draft a public defamation lawsuit. I shook my head, pushing the printed lies aside. I refuse to engage in a public screaming match with people who buy their megaphones with stolen money. A public relations war is fought with emotions, and emotions are volatile, messy, and prone to backfiring. I fight with cold, hard, indisputable data. I did not draft a public statement. I did not log into any social media platforms to defend my character. Instead, I opened a secure, encrypted channel and compiled a highly targeted digital portfolio. It contained exactly 14 pages. There were no emotional pleas or accusations. It consisted entirely of unredacted bank routing numbers, time-stamped wire transfers, and internal corporate cash flow ledgers. I attached a single, one-sentence cover letter stating that as the primary creditor, I had a legal obligation to report financial irregularities concerning secured assets. I bypassed the public entirely and sent the packet directly to the private email addresses of the 5 executive board members of the Sugar Crown Foundation, as well as the compliance officers of their 3 largest corporate sponsors. I knew the data would speak for itself, but I underestimated the sharp, terrifying competence of Eleanor Vance. Eleanor was the formidable, 70-year-old chairwoman of the foundation board. She was old money, fiercely protective of her charitable legacy, and utterly intolerant of scandal. Less than 4 hours after I sent the packet, Eleanor called Mara directly. She did not call to ask about the overarching financial health of the company. She called because she had spotted a fatal, glaring chronological error in the ledger that my own team had missed. Eleanor pointed out a specific, massive withdrawal from the Charity Reserve Fund, categorized as a regional community expense. The internal authorization document provided in my packet was signed by Celeste Watson, acting in her capacity as the Foundation's treasurer. The signature was dated the 12th of February. Eleanor coldly informed Mara that on the 12th of February, she had personally watched Celeste post multiple videos from a luxury ski lodge in Aspen, Colorado. Celeste had been out of the state for a full week surrounding that exact date. It was the ultimate, inescapable trap. Either Celeste had pre-signed blank authorization forms for Nolan to drain the charity at his discretion, or Nolan had blatantly forged my mother's signature to steal the funds while she was sipping champagne on a mountain. Either scenario constituted severe financial fraud. The fallout was instantaneous and catastrophic. At 3 o'clock on Thursday afternoon, Eleanor convened an emergency executive session of the foundation board. They did not invite my mother. By 5 o'clock, a formal courier delivered a sealed letter to the Watson estate. The board had voted unanimously to temporarily suspend Celeste from her role as treasurer, effective immediately, pending a full, independent, third-party audit of the charity's accounts. The dominoes began to fall with brutal speed. The following morning, a major regional bank, their primary corporate underwriter for the gala, issued a quiet but devastating press release. They announced they were formally suspending their annual pledge of $250,000 for the upcoming Sugar Crown campaign until Watson Sugar and Confections could provide a certified clean audit report. Nolan had tried to use the charity to starve me of public support, but my data had just starved him of his last remaining source of liquid cash. His runway had officially vanished. The pressure cooker inside the Watson household finally exploded. I did not need to be in the room to know they were tearing each other apart. The frantic digital trail told the entire story. I received an unhinged, tearful voicemail from Piper at 11 o'clock that night. She was no longer playing the victim for the cameras. She was sobbing, screaming that Celeste was threatening to disinherit her because of her social media posts, blaming Piper's loud mouth for drawing too much scrutiny to the family timeline. In the background of the audio message, I could hear the distinct sound of glass shattering and my mother shrieking at Nolan, demanding to know what he had done with her foundation money. The polished, perfect family was cannibalizing itself in the dark. Nolan had clearly lost control of the narrative, and his wife and mother-in-law were turning on him like cornered wolves. I sat in my quiet, dimly lit office, listening to the voicemail play out. I did not reply. I did not text back a witty remark or gloat over their internal collapse. I simply deleted the message and poured myself a glass of water. I maintained my absolute boundary. I would not lower myself to their level of hysteria, and I would not retaliate with personal scandals or petty vengeance. I was simply a mirror, reflecting their own corruption back at them. I stood perfectly still, holding the line, quietly pulling them closer and closer to the crushing reality of the truth they could no longer control. The atmosphere inside the Watson headquarters must have felt like a submarine taking on water. But Nolan Hale was still trying to sell tickets for a luxury cruise. On Tuesday morning, my internal network alerts flagged a flurry of highly classified executive emails. Nolan had called an emergency meeting with Celeste and Piper. He stood at the head of the boardroom table, practically vibrating with manic, adrenaline-fueled confidence. He announced that he had secured a massive strategic partner. The savior was Velvet Cane Beverage Company, a rapidly expanding national chain of premium craft sodas and teas. They wanted Watson Sugar as their exclusive supplier. Nolan spun a beautiful, intoxicating narrative for my mother and sister. He told them that once the ink dried on the national distribution contract, the massive influx of capital would instantly wipe out my debt, restore the charity foundation's depleted accounts, and elevate the Watson name back to its former glory. He sold them a seamless, miraculous salvation, but like everything Nolan touched, it was a spectacular, fragile lie of omission. My forensic team intercepted the actual term sheet drafted by Velvet Cane's legal department. The national beverage conglomerate was not run by fools. They had inserted a brutal, non-negotiable prerequisite hidden deep within the indemnity clauses. Before a single dollar changed hands, Watson Sugar had to provide absolute, unassailable proof of clean ownership over their flagship trademark, Watson Gold. The intellectual property had to be entirely free of liens, pending litigation, or covenant violations from any senior creditors. Nolan knew he was currently in breach of every single financial covenant attached to his loans. He was aggressively hiding the Velvet Cane trademark condition from his family, praying he could somehow forge the compliance certificates or bluff his way through the final signing before anyone realized he was selling a house he did not legally own. He thought he was running a brilliant shell game. He did not realize I owned the table, while Nolan was busy drafting fraudulent compliance memos. I was digging through the architectural blueprints of our family's history. The Watson Gold trademark was the beating heart of the empire. Without it, the company was just a collection of rusty vats and unbranded sucrose. I pulled my team off the current ledgers and ordered them to trace the intellectual property back to its absolute origin. It took us 3 days of relentless searching through municipal archives and dusty probate records. We finally located the original registration documents inside a forgotten storage unit previously leased by my grandfather's estate attorneys, a firm that had dissolved over a decade ago. The paperwork revealed a breathtaking oversight by Nolan's current legal team. The Watson Gold trademark was not directly owned by Watson Sugar and Confections. My grandfather, a paranoid but brilliant businessman, had placed the intellectual property into an obscure family trust before he died. The operating company merely leased the rights from that trust, and embedded deep within the fading, typewritten pages of that original trust instrument was a reversion clause. I sat in my office, tracing the lines of legalese with my index finger. The clause was a fail-safe mechanism designed to protect the family legacy from corporate mismanagement. It explicitly stated that if the trustees ever utilized trust assets for unsanctioned purposes, or if they catastrophically violated their fiduciary reporting obligations, the trademark lease would immediately terminate. The rights would revert entirely to the secondary beneficiaries under an independent, court-appointed governance structure. My mother and father had violated those exact fiduciary duties when they allowed Nolan to drain the foundation and secretly mortgage the estate. I did not wait. I immediately instructed Mara to locate the surviving estate guardian of my grandfather's dissolved trust. He was an 80-year-old retired judge living in Charleston. We moved with surgical speed. Through Gray Line Ledger Group, I formally and legally purchased the secondary beneficiary rights to the old trust. By Friday afternoon, a state circuit judge had officially stamped the transfer. I now held the detonator to the Watson Gold trademark. If I pulled the trigger and activated the reversion clause, Watson Sugar would instantly lose the legal right to print its own name on a single bag of sugar. It meant Velvet Cane Beverage Company would immediately walk away. It meant total, irreversible corporate death for my family. Late that evening, Mara stood by the window of our war room, looking out over the industrial district. The ambient glow of the city painted harsh shadows across her face. The tension in the room was thick, resembling the heavy, suffocating air of a factory floor right before a boiler blows. "This is a double-edged sword, Addison," Mara warned, her tone heavy with the gravity of the situation. "If you drop this reversion clause on the table right now, you will absolutely annihilate Nolan and your mother, but you will also stop the factory floor cold. The moment the trademark is suspended, production ceases, supply chains freeze. Within 48 hours, 300 innocent factory workers will be locked out of the gates with no severance and no health insurance. You will destroy the collateral to win the war." I looked down at the court-certified documents resting on my desk. I could hear the faint, distant hum of the factory machinery carrying across the night air. Those machines were operated by men and women who had spent their entire lives pouring their sweat into my family's legacy. I refused to let them become collateral damage in my mother's vanity project or Nolan's fraudulent schemes. "I am not going to activate it yet," I replied quietly, sliding the paperwork into a secure binder. "Timing is everything. If we kill the company today, the workers bleed. We let Nolan keep running. We let him build his fragile house of cards right up to the very edge of the signing table with Velvet Cane." I turned to my computer and opened a blank corporate structuring template. "We are going to prepare a clean acquisition protocol," I instructed Mara, my voice hardening into absolute resolve. "I want a shadow operating company fully incorporated by Monday. I want temporary payroll funds secured and ready to deploy. When Nolan inevitably crashes this enterprise, I am going to step into the wreckage and buy the physical assets and the factory out of receivership. I will keep the lines running. I will protect the workers. But when the dust settles, Celeste, Grant, Piper, and Nolan will be permanently barred from ever holding a single share of equity or stepping foot on the property again. Nolan thought he was racing against a ticking clock to save his empire. He had no idea the clock was already mine, and I was simply deciding what hour the alarm would ring. It was the evening before the scheduled signing with Velvet Cane Beverage Company. The air in my downtown office was entirely still, but across the city, the Watson family estate was suffocating under the crushing weight of its own secrets. I did not need to be physically present in their formal dining room to witness their collapse. I had a front-row seat to the disaster. My forensic accounting team had previously secured backdoor access to the corporate marketing department's cloud servers. That night, a junior public relations assistant, entirely unaware of the impending doom, began uploading raw, unedited video files to a shared drive. They were attempting to film a promotional comeback announcement to be released right after the contract signing. I sat in the sterile glow of my monitors, watching the polished facade of my family shatter into jagged pieces in real-time high definition. The setting was the grand dining room of the Watson estate, heavily staged with vintage crystal wine glasses, silver platters, and towering floral arrangements designed to project an impenetrable aura of generational wealth. Celeste was orchestrating the video shoot from behind the camera tripod. She aggressively directed my father, Grant, forcing him to sit squarely at the head of the long mahogany table. She commanded him to look directly into the lens and state confidently that the Watson family always stands united. Grant looked physically ill. His skin possessed a ghastly, ashen pallor, and his hands trembled so violently he had to grip the edge of the table to steady himself. I knew exactly why the patriarch of the family was shaking. Earlier that afternoon, my firm had processed a massive delinquency report. Grant had just received the final, certified overdue notice on the private mortgage for the very estate he was sitting inside. The bank was actively preparing to foreclose on the roof over his head, and the terror was eating him alive from the inside out. The camera kept recording, capturing the suffocating tension between the forced, plastic smiles. Piper was seated to Grant's right, wearing a designer evening gown. However, instead of paying attention to Celeste's stage directions, she was frantically tapping the screen of her mobile phone beneath the table. In the raw footage, I watched her expression contort from mild confusion into absolute, unadulterated panic. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. She held her phone out, her voice high and tight, cutting through the staged silence. She demanded Nolan look at the screen. She asked him to explain why the joint banking portal was showing a zero balance for her private graduate school fund, an account she had kept fiercely guarded for years. Nolan, who was standing near the ornate marble fireplace rehearsing his own lines, completely froze. The polished, arrogant armor he wore so easily in the boardroom evaporated. He had quietly leveraged their personal marital assets, draining her hidden educational fund to cover a desperate corporate margin call without speaking a single word to her. Nolan immediately attempted to deflect, stepping forward and speaking in harsh, hushed tones, warning her that the microphones were hot and the assistant was in the room. But Piper refused to back down. The illusion of her perfect, wealthy marriage shattered right there under the crystal chandeliers. She screamed at him, demanding to know where her money had gone, witnessing the sheer panic erupt in his youngest daughter. Grant finally reached his breaking point. He buried his face in his trembling hands, entirely ignoring Celeste's furious, shrill demands to sit up straight and smile for the camera. Grant confessed everything, his voice a hollow, defeated rasp that the sensitive lapel microphone picked up with terrifying clarity. He admitted to the entire table that he had signed a second personal financial guarantee just 1 week prior. He confessed that Nolan had convinced him it was merely a 10-day bridge loan to cover the final vendor payouts before the massive Velvet Cane signing. Nolan had sworn on his life it was a simple administrative formality. Grant looked up, tears streaming down his face, realizing aloud that if the deal failed tomorrow, the bank would officially seize the estate. They were going to lose everything they owned, The revelation struck the dining room with the force of a physical detonation. But my mother, entirely detached from reality and pathologically incapable of accepting failure, refused to absorb the blame. She stepped squarely into the frame, her face twisted and bitter. Absolute denial. She pointed a manicured finger toward the ceiling, hissing that the impending bankruptcy was not their fault. She loudly declared that the entire crisis was my doing. Celeste insisted that if I had not returned to sabotage their lives out of pure spite, if I had simply stayed away and allowed them to run their business, everything would have been perfectly smooth. She was thoroughly convinced that I was the villain destroying her paradise, completely ignoring the decades of fraud that had built it. Piper turned her attention back to her husband, truly seeing the desperation radiating from him for the very first time. She stopped screaming and asked him a chillingly calm question. She asked Nolan why he was constantly dodging her inquiries about the independent audit reports. She asked why he only ever emphasized the secret clauses with the buyer instead of showing the family the actual financial ledgers. She realized in that terrible moment that Nolan had been lying to her just as smoothly and effortlessly as he lied to the public. Cornered, exposed, and out of options, Nolan finally lost the last shred of his corporate composure. His face flushed a dark, furious crimson. He slammed his fist violently onto the dining table, rattling the expensive silverware and knocking over a crystal water glass. He roared at them, ordering his wife, his father-in-law, and his mother-in-law to shut their mouths immediately. He paced the room like a caged animal, shouting that he had spent the last 3 years keeping the sinking ship afloat while they all played dress-up and spent money they did not have. He asserted with maniacal confidence that after the signing ceremony the next morning, they would be richer than I could ever dream of being. He issued a final, dictatorial command, demanding that absolutely no one speak to the press or consult with any outside legal counsel until the ink was dry. The video file ended abruptly, cutting to a black screen as the terrified assistant finally realized they were recording a catastrophic family meltdown and shut the camera down. I sat back in my leather chair, letting out a slow, measured breath. The absolute silence of my office was a stark, jarring contrast to the hysterical screaming I had just witnessed. Mara Quinn sat across from my desk, quietly reviewing a separate stack of digital files, waiting for my next directive. At exactly 9 o'clock, an encrypted message arrived in my secure inbox. The sender was a verified, highly placed legal source operating deep within the Velvet Cane due diligence team. It was someone who recognized the catastrophic corporate liability of closing a major acquisition based on stolen intellectual property and wanted to quietly blow the whistle. Attached to the message was the final, unedited draft of the distribution contract scheduled to be executed the following morning. I opened the document and scrolled directly to the indemnity and asset ownership clauses. There it was, printed in stark black and white. Nolan was officially attempting to bind Watson Sugar and Confections to a massive national distribution network by pledging the Watson Gold trademark as a fully owned, legally unencumbered asset. He was preparing to commit federal corporate fraud on an astronomical scale. Using intellectual property he was entirely unqualified to control, hoping the massive influx of cash would somehow make the crime disappear. I printed the final page of the contract. The thick paper felt incredibly heavy in my hand. The Watson family was standing blindfolded in a room filled to the ceiling with gasoline, and Nolan was about to strike a match, thoroughly convinced the fire would bring them warmth. I slowly placed the printed contract into the secure manila folder that already contained the executed reversion clause paperwork. Mara looked up from her laptop, reading the quiet, absolute finality in my posture. I looked down at the compiled dossiers, flattening my hand against the cool surface of my desk. Tomorrow, I am not coming to beat them, I said quietly to Mara, ensuring every word carried the weight of a final verdict. I am coming to end this chain of lies without dragging the employees down with it. It was exactly 8:45 in the morning. The Apex conference room of the downtown commercial tower smelled of freshly brewed espresso and the sharp, metallic tang of ozone from the running copy machines. The floor-to-ceiling glass walls offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the city skyline. But the real cliff edge was inside this room. Nolan had scheduled the Velvet Cane Beverage Company signing for 9 o'clock sharp. What he did not know was that at exactly 8 o'clock, Mara Quinn had electronically filed a massive petition for an emergency covenant breach hearing with the Federal Commercial Court. The legal clock was ticking down simultaneously with his corporate countdown, and the two timelines were about to violently collide. Nolan walked through the heavy double-glass doors, looking like a man who had already conquered the world. His charcoal suit was perfectly tailored, his hair flawlessly styled, and his posture radiated an aggressive, almost manic confidence. He carried 3 thick, leather-bound portfolios containing the sanitized, heavily redacted financial disclosures he had prepared for the buyers. He truly believed that if he could just get the Velvet Cane executives to ink their signatures before the banks opened, the massive capital injection would instantly neutralize my leverage. He was running a desperate, blinding sprint against reality, hoping to cross the finish line before the ground completely collapsed beneath him. I arrived exactly 3 minutes later. I did not make a grand entrance or demand attention. I slipped into the room silently, accompanied only by Mara and an independent corporate auditor named David. We completely bypassed the massive mahogany bargaining table, where the executives were already shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries. Instead, we took 3 subtle chairs positioned against the far back wall, sitting strictly in the designated creditor observation area. I crossed my legs, placed my secure tablet on my lap, and watched the theater unfold. My mother, adorned in a conservative but breathtakingly expensive cream-colored suit, spotted me immediately. A flicker of sheer, unadulterated panic crossed her eyes, but she instantly buried it beneath a thick layer of practiced Southern charm. She turned brightly to the Velvet Cane representatives, gesturing toward me with a graceful sweep of her hand. She loudly proclaimed to the room how thrilled she was that her eldest daughter had returned to witness this historic family milestone, deliberately framing my presence as a touching 11th-hour reconciliation. She was desperately trying to leverage my physical presence to project an aura of stability, unity, and financial trust. I did not smile. I did not offer a warm greeting. I simply gave a blank, unreadable nod, letting the sharp corporate lawyers across the table draw their own wary conclusions from the freezing temperature in the room. At exactly 9:15, the Velvet Cane lead counsel, a sharp-eyed, ruthless man named Marcus, tapped his heavy gold pen against the crisp pages of the master contract. The room fell entirely silent. Marcus cleared his throat and stated flatly that before they proceeded to the final execution phase, his internal risk management department required a verbal, on-the-record confirmation of several key liabilities. Their legal analysts had caught wind of the sudden executive suspension at the Charity Foundation the day before, and they had flagged a severe irregularity regarding the Watson Gold intellectual property registration. Marcus looked directly at Nolan, asking for absolute, legally binding assurance that the trademark was completely unencumbered and that the charity audit would not expose the parent company to any collateral legal damage or public relations nightmares. The air in the room grew instantly thin. Nolan swallowed hard, a microscopic tightening of his throat being the only physical tell of his internal terror. Then, he opened his mouth and delivered a flawless, catastrophic lie. He confidently assured Marcus that the charity suspension was merely a proactive, routine administrative review initiated by the family itself. He then firmly stated that the Watson Gold trademark was owned entirely free and clear by the operating entity, completely devoid of any external liens, reversion clauses, or trust complications. He was committing federal fraud in a room full of corporate attorneys. Mara shifted slightly in her chair beside me, her pen hovering aggressively over her legal pad. I placed a hand gently on her forearm, silently ordering her to hold her fire. I wanted Nolan to weave the rope thick and tight. I let him formally state his fraudulent claims, cementing his own perjury in front of a dozen highly credible witnesses. Right as Nolan reached forward to align the signature pages, my phone vibrated intensely against my hip. The private caller identification flashed my father's secure cell number. I stood up silently, the thick carpet masking my footsteps, and stepped out into the quiet, marble-lined corridor. I accepted the call. Grant was hyperventilating on the other end of the line. His voice was a ragged, high-pitched wheeze of pure panic. He confessed that a legal courier had just arrived at the front gates of the estate. The regional bank had not waited for the end of the business day. They had issued an immediate, accelerated call notice on the private residential mortgage due to the secondary loan defaults. The grace period was entirely gone. Grant begged me, audibly sobbing into the receiver, pleading with me to use my firm's capital to stall the bank. He asked me to save the house first, promising wildly that we could figure out the corporate mess later. He was asking me to bleed my own secure assets to protect his vanity and his front lawn. I listened to his frantic, wet breathing echoing through the phone speaker. I felt absolutely nothing. There was no residual anger, no sorrow, just a cold, clinical clarity. "I am going to protect the factory workers," I said, my voice perfectly steady and completely devoid of warmth. "And I am going to protect my daughter. The rest of this is the direct consequence of your own choices." I terminated the call without waiting for his response, turned around, and walked purposefully back into the conference room. Marcus had the gold pen poised perfectly over the bottom line of the contract. Nolan was leaning forward, his eyes practically burning a hole through the paper, holding his breath as salvation hovered just millimeters away. My tablet chimed a sharp, high-pitched tone. It was a secure notification from the federal clerk's office. The emergency injunction had been formally reviewed and approved by the commercial judge exactly 5 minutes early. "Put the pen down, Marcus," I said. My voice was not loud, but it possessed a sharp, metallic authority that instantly paralyzed the entire room. Marcus froze, his hand hovering mid-air. Nolan whipped his head around, his face suddenly draining of all color, replacing his arrogant flush with a sickly, terrified gray. "As the primary secured creditor holding the defaulted senior notes of Watson Sugar and Confections," I announced, walking slowly and deliberately toward the center of the main table, "I am hereby executing an immediate, court-ordered freeze on all corporate asset transfers and intellectual property licensing. The emergency federal hearing regarding multiple severe financial covenant breaches has been officially granted, and it is effectively commencing right now." I slapped the heavily stamped, certified digital injunction directly onto the polished mahogany table, sliding it right over top of Nolan's fraudulent distribution contract. "Boy." "No one is signing anything," I continued, locking eyes with Nolan as his entire fabricated universe began to collapse inward. "We are transitioning this room into an immediate, on-site legal review. Nobody leaves this floor until we pull the actual ledgers and expose exactly what you have been trying to sell." I stood at the head of the polished mahogany table, replacing Nolan as the absolute center of gravity in the room. The Velvet Cane executives, their corporate counsel, the independent auditors, and the Emergency Receivership Committee all turned their focus entirely to me. I did not raise my voice, nor did I gloat. I simply opened my leather binder and began distributing the forensic packets. I walked them through the clinical, undeniable timeline of federal financial violations. I detailed the systematic misappropriation of the charitable foundation capital, the deliberate falsification of their mandatory quarterly audit schedules, and the active concealment of millions of dollars in spoiled, unsaleable inventory. Finally, I turned to the Velvet Cane representatives and pointed out the most critical, fatal offense. They were sitting at a table actively negotiating the purchase of an asset that the seller had absolutely no legal authority to pledge. Mara Quinn stepped forward, her movements precise and unhurried. She placed a single, court-certified document directly in front of Marcus, the lead counsel for Velvet Cane. It was the activated reversion clause. I explained to the room that due to gross fiduciary negligence and the blatant, documented misuse of family trust assets by the executive officers, the operational rights to the Watson Gold trademark had been instantly and legally suspended. The intellectual property was no longer under the purview of Watson Sugar and Confections. It had been officially transferred into an independent, court-appointed governance trust earlier that morning. They could not sell the name. They could not license the historical logo. And as of that exact second, they could not legally print their own brand on a single grain of commercial sugar. Marcus did not argue. Corporate lawyers of his caliber do not gamble with stolen intellectual property and federal fraud. He simply closed his heavy gold pen, placed it in his breast pocket, and snapped his leather briefcase shut. He announced clearly to the room that Velvet Cane Beverage Company was immediately withdrawing from all negotiations, citing an unacceptable and catastrophic threshold of legal risk. The miraculous rescue deal, Nolan's ultimate phantom lifeline, evaporated into thin air right before his eyes. Nolan collapsed back into his leather chair, his breathing shallow and erratic, staring blankly at the far wall as if his soul had been forcefully extracted from his body. The emergency receivership board braced for the final, lethal blow. They fully expected me to call the massive debt and order the immediate, brutal liquidation of the physical manufacturing plant. I did not. I opened the second folder on my tablet. I submitted a highly structured, conditional operational takeover plan. A fully capitalized subsidiary of Greyline Ledger Group would immediately inject sufficient emergency operating liquidity to keep the factory lines running and guarantee the payroll for every single blue-collar worker on the floor. However, the capital injection came with an absolute, non-negotiable mandate. The entire Watson family was to be immediately stripped of all executive titles, boardroom seats, and financial signing authority. They were entirely excised from the corporate structure. The receivership board and the secondary creditors reviewed the proposal for less than 5 minutes before giving their unanimous consent. It was the only viable path to save the enterprise without endorsing a criminal syndicate. Nolan Hale was officially stripped of his power on the spot, reduced to a powerless trespasser inside his own headquarters, witnessing the total collapse of her empire. My mother shattered. Her perfectly curated, stoic Southern matriarch persona violently fractured in front of the city's most powerful legal and financial figures. Celeste stood up, her hands trembling violently, tears streaming down her carefully powdered face. She desperately attempted to play the agonizing role of a wounded mother, pleading with me to withdraw the injunction and step down from the management transition. She begged me to yield, crying out that I needed to drop the legal action for the preservation of our family honor. The entire room fell dead silent, profoundly embarrassed by the raw, desperate display. I looked directly into her tear-filled eyes. I felt absolutely no pity. My voice was perfectly flat and uncompromising. Honor is not something you have left to bargain with. The formal proceedings concluded swiftly after that, but the true emotional climax occurred out in the quiet, marble-lined corridor near the elevator banks. As Mara and I walked toward the exit, they cornered me. Celeste, Grant, Piper, and Nolan. The formerly united front of the Watson family was now completely broken. They surrounded me, their voices overlapping in a pathetic, chaotic chorus of pleading. They begged me to come back to them, but looking at their frantic, terrified faces, the ultimate truth crystallized perfectly in my mind. They were not apologizing for throwing me out into the freezing cold 6 years ago. They were not expressing genuine love, deep remorse, or a sudden, desperate desire to finally know my daughter. They were begging me to use my wealth, my untarnished professional reputation, and my corporate leverage to save their sinking estate, to rescue their hijacked social status, and to buy back the beautiful, sugar-coated lie they had been selling to the world for decades. I held up a single hand, and their frantic pleading instantly ceased. I delivered my final, unalterable ultimatum. I informed them that I was establishing an irrevocable trust fund specifically designed to preserve the pensions and jobs of the factory workers. Furthermore, I agreed to authorize a modest, heavily monitored transition stipend for my father. It would be exactly enough capital to secure a small, safe condominium, ensuring he would not be left entirely on the street when the bank formally foreclosed on the ancestral estate by the end of the month. But this financial mercy came with an ironclad, legally binding cost. They were required to sign a comprehensive non-disparagement agreement. There would be absolutely no personal contact moving forward. They were legally barred from ever using my daughter Nora's name, image, or likeness in any future public relations or charitable capacity. They were to cease all interference in my life permanently. There would be no tearful reunions, no forced holiday dinners, and no returning to play the role of the dutiful, obedient daughter in their toxic, crumbling house. They stood frozen in the hallway, silently absorbing the cold, clinical finality of their new reality, as the heavy elevator doors quietly slid shut, severing my physical ties to them forever. I walked out of the commercial tower and stepped into the bright, warm afternoon sun. I drove back to my quiet neighborhood. I walked through the front door of my home, immediately greeted by the beautiful sound of Nora laughing as she played in the living room. That evening, we sat at our small wooden dining table, eating a peaceful, simple dinner together. Outside those walls, a century-old sugar empire was violently changing hands, and the high society circles were undoubtedly whispering endlessly about the spectacular fall of the Watson dynasty. But sitting there, listening to my daughter talk about her day, I realized something profoundly liberating. For the first time in my entire 34 years of existence, the deep, aching need to be recognized, validated, and loved by my family was completely gone. They had finally dropped to their knees and begged me to return to them. But the broken, desperate young woman they had so ruthlessly chased away all those years ago simply did not live in that cage anymore. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please leave a comment telling me where you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts. And I invite you to subscribe to the Zoe Revenge Stories channel. Like the video, and show your support by pressing the hype button so the story in this video can be heard by many more people.